Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I want to devote this particular session to different types of growth and primarily disruptive growth. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, there are three types of growth when we talk about growth engines and building growth for your business. The first of those is known as sustaining growth. The second is known as innovative growth. And the third is known as disruptive growth. Those are three different levels of growth, and with respect to those, each one has their own formula, if you will, or their own process to be able to create a growth engine that falls into each one of these categories. I have a separate session specifically talking about those aspects of growth which are sustaining, and a separate section dealing with those that are innovative. So what I want to do during this particular session is talk specifically about those which are involved in, and I have to actually get this moving, that are involved in the disruptive category of growth. So let's talk about that first. And before I do, I want to just simply make a comment, because when we take a look at the process for innovative growth, what's relevant is the fact that it's extremely difficult, disruptive growth. What's important to recognize is that it's very difficult for an organization to countenance disruptive ideas just simply because of the nature of the institution. So I have a transparency, I have a PowerPoint for you that I want to just simply take a look at. When we're dealing with a disruptive growth engine, what we're recognizing is that the entire institution that you've got is an institution that has institutional intransigence. Recognize that the institution by definition is successful, or they would not be pursuing different types of disruptive growth opportunities. And so when you allow that disruptive idea, or you allow the process team that's involved with disruptive ideas to get close to the institution, the reality is it gets sucked in, because you have this massive institutional structure that is doing what they're doing, and they're doing it relatively well. That's why when I talk about sustaining growth, I talk about a completely different set of processes that are involved in finding growth engines for a sustaining business. But in this particular case, we have the business. It is a sustaining business. And what we're talking about is how you create disruptive growth opportunities within that context. So with that, let me put up the PowerPoint. I want to talk to you about the particular items that we're going to be associating with a disruptive growth engine. What's the idea? The idea is that disruptive growth is not something that just occurs randomly. You can't just simply, every once in a while, the possibility of a good idea coming about that turns out to be disruptive would be sensational. But the reality of it is, in most institutions and organizations, it doesn't work that way. There is a particular process that's involved in making sure that you have disruptive growth opportunities that are coming up. What I want to talk about is what those ideas are at this point. Very first one, I want you to recognize that it's important to develop disruptive growth processes prior to you actually needing them. What does that mean? Well, if you have a business that for whatever reason, the growth has leveled off, and now the senior managers or the owners or the founders have made a determination that now I've got to go find out, I've got to go discover some type of thing, some type of growth opportunity that's going to really jar my business success forward. What happens is by that point, it's too late. Because what you can't do with disruptive growth opportunities is just simply shove it down the line. What's important is that you develop these processes early on so that you can patiently mine those as time goes on. So what's the best time to start a growth engine for your disruptive business? The best time is when you're most successful. The best time is now, at a time in which you don't need the disruptive growth. If your business is doing extremely well, and if you're going forward and you like what you see, that's the time to incorporate a disruptive growth engine into your business so that you have the time to be able to appropriately cultivate that. So first of all, what's the first thing you do? Start before you actually need to. Second comment, in terms of developing a disruptive growth engine. The people that have to drive a disruptive growth engine, those people, therefore, who are in charge of the disruptive growth team that we'll talk about in just a second, has to be the senior executive who has the ability to be able to make the decisions. If I'm going to be going into an environment where I'm suggesting to a group of people, listen, I understand the way we always do it. I understand those are successful for us, but that's not what I'm trying to accomplish here. What I'm trying to find is something which is disruptive. As a matter of fact, could be so disruptive to the industry that it's actually disruptive to our core business that actually brings us to the table to begin with. The only way that I can accomplish that is if I have the panache, if I have the hierarchical structure, that I'm sitting on top of the hierarchy and I have the ability to be able to bring that mandate down. If I'm dealing with a junior level executive or a junior level manager or a director, the possibility of that particular person having the, not so much the credibility, but the simple authority to drive those types of disruptive ideas down the pike, that simply isn't going to happen when we're dealing with an institution that is over here. One of the reasons why disruption can occur so easily when we're dealing with companies that are outside the mainframe, why you had a Netflix as opposed to Blockbusters, is because it was virtually impossible inside Blockbusters, as an example, to have a disruption, because that just simply wasn't going to happen. Their entire infrastructure, similar to that institutional box that I just talked about, was way over here. My point to you is, if you are in fact not in that startup capacity, but you have a business and you want to see what it's going to take to be able to create a disruptive growth engine for that business, you've got to make sure it's being driven by the top dog. It's being driven by the people on the very top of the institutional chain, because they're the ones who have the authority to be able to make that happen. Very often in corporate America, what they've done is they have relegated these types of growth opportunities to individuals who have been delegated down to, as opposed to being driven from the front. So, second concept, we're talking about a senior executive to lead the team. The third concept, you need to have an entire deployment team. There's got to be a growth and a disruptive growth team that is handling all portions of it. What does that mean? These are people that are focused on growth, number one. These are people who also have the different aspects of what's appropriate. They've got marketing backgrounds. Others have product production backgrounds. Others are coming from the financial side. Others are coming from the legal side. But it's an actual team that is being put together for one particular function, and that's to identify the particular growth opportunities that might very well be disruptive to either the industry or the company itself. That deployment team is not just functionally diverse, but they're also from a skill set diverse. And what do I mean by that? The fact is, a person who is a good, solid manager and a good, solid administrator, you want those people involved in the operation of your business. These are people who create steady cast with respect to just simply the way that your business operates. But those people are not necessarily the right people that you want on your disruptive team. The ones that you want on your disruptive team are different. These are stallions. These are thoroughbreds. These are people who are iconoclastic. They're people who are entrepreneurial. They're people who are not looking at the way things are being done. They're looking at what could occur, what might happen, how could it be done, and how could it be addressed, not only with respect to the tenets and the assumptions that we currently are using, but what are we attempting to solve for that maybe our business right now hasn't even thought about solving for. So I'm talking about having a deployment team that not only looks at things from the standpoint of their functional capabilities and task performance capacities, but are looking at it from an attitudinal structure which is extremely different than what is otherwise in the mainstream of the institutional business, which is really about performing at optimal levels. It's not about performing at a completely disruptive level. So number 3, a deployment team. Number 4, deployment processes. To the same extent, and as you know from prior of these sessions, I am a big believer with respect to SOPs, standard operating procedures, because what you want to be able to do is you want to find best practices, and once you've found that best practice, You want to memorialize that thing, and you want to institutionalize it as part of your organization. Well, it's exactly the same thing with disruptive growth. With disruptive growth, there are processes involved in the opportunity to be able to engender ideas. And those processes don't come from the mainstream processes inside your business. They come from the fact that you are attempting to dig primarily for those aspects, that chemistry, the alchemy of the way a particular market is being addressed, so that you can identify those things which provide a completely different solution than possibly what is actually being delivered by the industry or by your company for that matter. And in the process of looking at that separate alchemy, you're going to be asking questions that are completely different than the questions that you would ordinarily be asking inside the mainstream. The development of those processes become almost a component, both inductive as well as deductive, of the initial orientation of that deployment team. So, deployment process is number 4. Number 5, I talk about an isolated unit. You cannot house a disruptive growth deployment team inside with the mainstream business. And I know that so many people are familiar with what Apple did, where they completely sequestered these people. Or Google, when they talk about theirs, 3M was one of the original ones to have done it at their level. These are companies that basically recognize that the last thing in the world you want to do is to be able to use a particular disruptive deployment team and mainstream them in some way that they continue to be tainted, for want of a better word, with institutional thinking, or their ideas get sucked back into the mainstream, which means they're ultimately going to get diffused, if not completely marginalized. So what you want to do is isolate them entirely. You isolate them off of your campus, you isolate them off of your business, you give them separate entry, you give them separate security codes. You make sure that they are not going to be sucked in to the gravity, if you will, that otherwise sucks them into the institution that you've got. So isolated unit, I guess that's number 5. And finally, before I finish this off, I want to talk about task performers. Companies have task performers. You would want them to have task performers. These are people who are good at performing particular tasks, and that's what you want them to do. They are not going to be thinking about disruptive ideas. So you can't really have those people involved in the disruptive deployment process or exploration process. But here's the rub. Those task performers are the ones that have the closest access to the things which are being done inside the business. They are a wealth of knowledge, whether they're on the front end with respect to customer service, or it has to do with a particular process deliverable, or it has to do, they're salespeople and they hear all the time about their customers, and when they're out there selling, they have an understanding of what those customers actually want on an ongoing basis. So task performers, I want to just simply suggest to you, are a wealth of information in the disruptive development process. Because when we're doing that and we're getting the feedback on an ongoing basis, these people can provide that type of feedback to you. Now, here's what I want you to recognize about them. To ask them to be able to be on the lookout for disruptive ideas is simply going to be, it's a thankless task. Number one, they don't know how to do it. Number two, they're not part of your disruptive deployment team, so they're not going to really be valuable to that extent. However, where they do become valuable is when you provide focus opportunities to be interviewing them based upon areas that you come up with, which might be from a confirmatory standpoint, or in areas which are just simply exploratory, and you have open dialogue within a particular structure of interviews and discussion groups that are just simply intended to be greenfield discussions available to you. So I just want to suggest to you, and that's why I call it mine the task performers, because they become extremely fruitful. So real quick summary, and then we'll finish up. There are 3 forms of growth. You have the growth that's appropriate for a sustaining business. You have the growth appropriate for an innovative business. And you have the growth that is indeed disruptive, not just an innovative one, but a disruptive one. With respect to the disruptive business opportunity and the growth engine that comes out of that, the 6 rules that I've identified for you were 6 rules to make that easier for you to be able to implement. Glad to have been with you, and I'll look forward to our next session together. Take care. Bye-bye.